We talked about reactive forms last week, but we mostly focused on building them in your front-end Angular application. What we're going to talk about in this video is how to sync them with a back-end database like Firestore. What I want to show you today is how to build an Angular directive that you can drop into any existing reactive form, and it will sync the form data to a document or collection that you specify in Firestore. In the demo you're looking at right now, you'll see that when the user types into the form, it will say the form is modified. Then it's going to debounce or wait for the user to stop typing for at least 2 seconds, and then it will save the form to the database. I really like this approach because it provides a single directive for all of your reactive forms, so you get consistent functionality throughout the application. The tricky part is that you need to manage the state between Firestore and the reactive form. For example, before we send off a write request to the database, we need to make sure that the reactive form is valid and that it can be submitted. And also, if there's any errors on the back end, we'll want to catch those and show them in the UI. So the first thing we'll do to get started is generate a directive called Fireform. And I'm assuming that you're in an Angular 6 project and that you have Angular Fire 2 installed. Before we actually build it, I want to show you how it's used by a component. You can see here we have a form group that's bound to this form element, and then we have our Fireform directive that also takes in a path attribute that points to a collection in Firestore. In this case, it will automatically generate a new Firestore document and then save the contents of the reactive form to it. But in many cases, you might already have existing data that you want to modify in a form. In that case, you can pass in a document ID, which in this case we're calling test, and it will automatically pull that data from Firestore and populate it in the reactive form. So that's super useful when you have data that the user can go back and edit later on, maybe their address, phone number, etc. Now let's jump into the directive. There's quite a few things to get through here, but it's all in an effort to make this directive reusable throughout multiple components. We have a handful of imports here from Angular Core, as well as Angular Firestore, and a few things from RxJS. One of the most important things that we'll do is intercept the form group from the component by adding it as an input property on this directive. Then we'll also give it a path, which is the path to the Firestore document or collection, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Then we actually have a pretty complex state management situation here. The form might be loading, it might be synced with Firestore, which means the reactive form and Firestore have the same data. It might be modified, where the reactive form is different than Firestore. And it can also be in an error state, which means Firestore sent an error after we tried to update the form. Now, we want the parent component to be able to listen to these state changes and also errors. So we're going to emit those as custom events through outputs. And then lastly, we'll declare a variable for our document reference, as well as one for a subscription, so we can unsubscribe when this component is destroyed. When the component is initialized, there are two main things that we want to happen. We want to preload any existing data from Firestore, and then we want to autosave any changes that occur. Before we can implement these methods, we need a way to change the state and also emit the state up to the parent component. To do that, I'm going to use a setter, which when used will set the internal state to the new value and also emit the state change up through the event emitter that we defined earlier. This allows the parent component to listen to state changes and show a different message in the UI depending on the state that this form is in. The next thing we'll want is a method that can update the document in Firestore. A Firestore set or update returns a promise, so we'll make this an async function, and then we'll just point to our document reference and update it with the form group value. When we know the form has been updated in the back end, we can update our state using that setter by just defining the state as synced. It's possible an update can fail on the back end, for example, if a Firestore security rule is triggered. So we'll catch errors here and then emit the form state as an error if this happens. Now we can implement our preload data method. This method will be used when we have existing data in the database. And when it first fires, we want to set the state to loading. From there, I have this getDocRef method, which we'll define last, but basically it just determines if we're dealing with a document or a collection. Then we'll get the document as an observable with value changes and pipe in the tap operator. On the form group, we can call patch value to take the data from this document and patch it into the form. At this point, it'll mark the form as dirty, which isn't technically true because the user hasn't done anything to the form, so we'll then mark it as pristine. And we'll go ahead and set the state to synced. When dealing with forms, you generally don't need them to be a real-time stream, so I'm going to also add in the take one operator here just to prevent any unnecessary reads. Then call subscribe to run it, and remember that we're calling this function during ng on init. So it gets called once when the directive is initialized. Now let's take a look at our autosave method. For this one, we're going to keep it as a real-time stream of the reactive form changes. Just like before, we can pipe in the tap operator, and as soon as a change happens, we want to set the form state as modified. Then it would be super inefficient and expensive to write to the database after every change, so what we'll do is pipe in a debounce time of 2000 milliseconds, which will wait for the user to stop typing for at least 2000 milliseconds before executing the next operator in this observable pipe. So the order of operators here is really important. The first tap will get executed on every form value change, but the second tap we're going to use is only executed when this debounce of 2000 seconds finishes. What we want to do when this debounce time ends is make sure that the form is valid, and then we'll also want to make sure that the internal state is modified. As long as everything looks good there, we'll go ahead and update the document in the backend database. And that's pretty much all it takes to build an auto-saving reactive form. RxJS makes this way easier than it would be otherwise. But there's still a couple things we need to fully flesh this out. We still want the user to be able to submit the form and have it update in Firestore like normal. To do that, we can listen to the ng-submit event, and we'll intercept it and then run our setDoc method whenever that happens. That just allows the user to submit the form without having to wait for the autosave debounce to expire. The other thing we need to do is determine if we're dealing with a collection or a document based on the path. If we break up a document path by slashes, we know that every odd-numbered segment is a collection and every even-numbered segment is a document. So if the path is an odd number, we're going to create a new document from scratch using Angular Firestore create ID. Otherwise, we'll make the document reference with the path that was provided to us. And last but not least, we'll want to implement ng on destroy to unsubscribe from the form when this component is destroyed. Reactive form subscriptions can be pretty expensive, so this is very important, especially if you have many reactive forms throughout your application. We can use the directive to display helpful messages like this. When it's blue, we know that the form is preloading some data from the database. Then once it is synced, it'll turn green. When the user starts typing into the form, it will turn yellow, saying there are unsaved changes. And it will stay in the state if the form is invalid, because we're not going to save the form unless it's valid. After the form goes into a valid state and the user stops typing, it will debounce for 2 seconds and then turn green once again. There is very little we need to do to get this working in a component. So here we'll build out a reactive form very quickly. If you missed the last reactive forms video, make sure to watch this because it's just the basic form that we used in that video. The only thing that's special in the component is that we need to listen to state changes. So for that, I set up a state property on this component, and then we'll listen to the state changes that we defined in our directive and set them as a property on this component so we can show different templates based on the state. If you look at the HTML, I've set up a couple divs here, and I'm just using ngIf and pointing to the string state that we defined in the directive, and for each one showing a different notification message. You could also use an ng switch statement here as well. Then if we scroll down a little bit, we'll see we already have our reactive form set up with our Fire form pointing to the contacts collection in Firestore. Then we can listen to our custom event, which is state change, and use our change handler to update the property on this component whenever that state changes. And then lastly, we'll set up the form control values. There's nothing different that we need to use. We just use these like a vanilla reactive form. I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up there. Again, I want to reiterate that this directive is super useful, and I've used it in a number of projects throughout the last year or two since I started working with Angular and Firebase together. If you have any questions, please reach out to me on Slack. Thanks again for being a pro member, and I'll talk to you soon.